The Victoria Mounted Rifles. The Victoria Mounted Rifles were established in Victoria County, north of Durban, in 1862. Like other Natal volunteer units, the Victoria Mounted Rifles were established in order to provide a military presence for the protection and policing of Natal, with British Imperial forces often stretched too thin to adequately garrison all the colonial frontiers. The Victoria Mounted Rifles were originally only a section of the Royal de Urban Rangers. The Rangers were disbanded in 1869, and with this, the Victoria Mounted Rifles became a fully independent volunteer corps. The uniform of the Victoria Mounted Rifles consisted of a dark blue tunic with the collar edged in red braid. The cuffs were pointed and dark blue with red braid forming an Austrian knot. The shoulder straps were dark blue with red lining. The buttons on the tunic were of white metal. Trousers were dark blue and had a broad red stripe down the seam. Boots were of black leather and reached around the mid-calf. For campaigning in 1879, a white helmet was issued, much like the British Foreign Service helmet. It had a white metal spike, and it seems no badge was present. Also issued was a dark blue, French-style kepe, with a red browband and a small, white metal badge with the monogram VMR. The Victoria Mounted Rifles received their marching orders on the 2nd of December 1878, in preparation for the expected hostilities to come with the Zulus. They were led at this time by Yorkshireman Captain Charles Sainer, who took command of the unit in 1875. They left their headquarters at Verulam and made their way to Pietermaritzburg and then on to Thring's Post, close to the Zulu border, by the 6th of December. Here, they would have met with another unit of Natal volunteers, the Stanger Mounted Rifles. The Victoria Mounted Rifles mustered with 3 officers and 42 men. More would join them later, and 2 failed to show, promptly being branded deserters. In total, 50 men served throughout the war with the Victoria Mounted Rifles. The Mounted Natal Volunteers had been brought onto the campaign against the Zulus at the request of Lord Chelmsford, the general officer commanding. He had a complete lack of regular Imperial cavalry and had to make good on this glaring shortcoming with what was locally available. The various Natal volunteer units were an ideal solution. Despite initial unwillingness and opposition from Sir Henry Bulwer, the then Lieutenant Governor of the colony of Natal, Lord Chelmsford was allowed to take the volunteers on campaign in Zululand. On the whole, the various volunteers were very enthusiastic to offer their services. Their personal motivations varied from the feeling of duty, a chance for action, a sense of adventure, and a myriad of things that encourage men to set off on campaign. The Victoria Mounted Rifles were attached to No. 1 Column, the Coastal Column, under Colonel Charles Pearson. The Victoria and Stanger Mounted Rifles rode together to the Lower Tukela on the 11th of January in preparation to cross into Zululand. The Victoria Mounted Rifles found themselves, together with around 100 other Natal volunteers, under the command of Brevet Major Percy Henley Stanley Barrow. Barrow had volunteered as a special service officer who found himself in command of No. 1 Column's mounted troops. The lightly built, red-haired cavalry officer was a good fit for the job, having served in the 19th Hussars and as commandant of the School of Instruction for Auxiliary Cavalry. When the time for crossing the Tukela did come, on the 12th of January, the column was hard at work, especially the Naval Brigade, in ferrying the soldiers, horses, and wagons across to the Zulu bank. The crossing was uncontested. As Lieutenant Roberts, of the Victoria Mounted Rifles observed, nothing happened. Nobody attempted to approach us. The long and often grueling march from the Tukela to the Nyezane River and the large battle that would be fought there saw a lot of activity for the Victoria Mounted Rifles. As a part of Major Barrow's command, they were continuously performing reconnaissance, patrolling, and providing picket duty to the camps established on the way. The story of this journey is told in greater detail in my video on the Stanger Mounted Rifles. As the Victoria Mounted Rifles had a very similar experience and were often paired with the Stangers, I will avoid repetition here and suggest viewing that video after this one for the story of that march. On the 22nd of January, an early morning patrol of mounted men was sent out to scout the way from one of the overnight camps through the grassland and bushes up to the Nyezane River. This group likely included members of the Victoria Mounted Rifles. They were scouting for the 1st Division, created when Colonel Pearson split his column into a mobile 1st Division and a slower 2nd Division, bringing up most of the wagons. With the Victoria Mounted Rifles in this mobile 1st Division were the Stanger Mounted Rifles, the Natal Hussars, and the Mounted Infantry. as well as all 8 companies of the Buffs, 2 7-pounder guns of the Royal Artillery, Royal Engineers, HMS Active's landing party with guns, rockets, and a Gatling gun, half a company of Natal Pioneers, and 7 Natal Native Contingent companies from the 1st Battalion, 2nd Regiment, all under the personal command of Colonel Pearson. The mounted patrol crossed the Nyezane River to find an open, flat piece of ground on the other side. Lieutenant Roberts of the Victoria Mounted Rifles noted it was the same ground through which he and others had passed 6 years earlier, when they were part of the British delegation that attended King Cetshwayo's coronation. He described the area as a grassy space, almost surrounded by straggling bush. Here, Barrows suggested to Pearson as a place to halt. Pearson, although wary of the surrounding bush, accepted the proposition. Here the track took a sharp turn left and continued to rise up a series of terraces. The area was flanked by bush-choked ravines, and the right by the impressive Wombane Hill. The Victoria Mounted Rifles had been allowed to fall out, along with the Stangers, and enjoy a rest after their hard work scouting the way to the Nyezane. The men enjoyed a breakfast of biscuit and tinned beef. Some of them stripped off their uniforms and took the chance to bathe in a nearby stream. They would have observed the first wagons making their way to the appointed halt area, and Major Barrows in discussion with some volunteer officers. For the men of the Victoria Mounted Rifles, this respite would be all too quickly ended by the crack of a gunshot, rolling through the valleys. The men would have been alert. Then they heard the thunder of a rough volley coming down from the hills. That started the volunteers moving in a flash. Men of the Victoria Mounted Rifles grabbed their carbines and sprang to their feet. Others stumbled out of the stream and hurriedly threw on their uniforms and grabbed their kit. They fell in by their horses. A comrade in the Stangers was hit in the leg by a spent round. Mounting up, the Victoria Mounted Rifles rode back to the track and, alongside the Stangers, halted alongside the first parked wagons. They saw the mounted infantry and the Natal Hussars in position to the right of the track. They advanced on foot around 50 yards and opened fire on the Zulus now coming into sight. The Victoria Mounted Rifles and the Stangers, in the meantime, dismounted to the left of the track with their backs to the mounted infantry and the Hussars. They advanced in skirmish order to a rise that gave them a clear view of their surroundings. Here, the Victoria Mounted Rifles and the Stangers saw a disorganized group of black men running in their direction out of a ravine. They brought their carbines up to their shoulders and opened fire, only to quickly cease fire when they realized they were firing on the retreating Natal native contingent of Captain Hart. The NNC had gone ahead to investigate a small group of Zulus. They had found instead Kodida's large Zulu army and had inadvertently initiated the battle. They were lying in ambush and waiting for the British column. Collapsing in the face of the sudden Zulu attack, the NNC had fled. Now the Victoria Mounted Rifles looked to their front to see a large number of Zulus advance over the crest of a spur up the road. The British scrambled from their vulnerable position to counter the Zulu attack. Colonel Pearson, commanding from a knoll, brought his infantry, naval brigade, artillery, rockets, and a Gatling gun into position against the Zulu left horn. The Zulus braved the intense British fire to the foot of the Wombane before being forced to seek cover. They skirmished with great skill and sustained a heavy, yet largely ineffectual fire against the British. As the battle got underway, the Zulu chest and right horn came into view, whilst at the Nyezane, more wagons were brought up and parked, with British reinforcements being doubled to the firing line. As the intense fight to keep the left horn at bay continued, the Zulu chest occupied a homestead around 300 yards to the left front of the knoll on a spur. Here they opened fire on the British and threatened their flank. The Victoria Mounted Rifles and the Stangers were formed up, around 200 yards to the left of the knoll. The men of the Victoria Mounted Rifles remained in skirmish order and used their carbines to great effect, engaging the Zulu chest that had appeared and occupied the homestead. The Zulus were often praised for their skirmishing abilities by the British, able to maneuver large bodies of men quickly from cover to close in with their enemy. The troopers of the Victoria Mounted Rifles would have had to manage a sustained and accurate fire when a target presented itself to try and hold the Zulus back. Here they succeeded. The Zulus had tried to deploy into the horn formation towards a spur parallel to the British line. They ran straight into the Victoria Mounted Rifles and the Stangers, who kept up a withering fire. The Zulus who tried to press forward toward the volunteers had to cross an open stretch of ground in order to close in. Lieutenant Roberts of the Victoria Mounted Rifles describes this moment. They were evidently intending to come down upon us. Our men behaved capitally. At first there was a little excitement, but no sign of fear. In fact, it seemed a pleasant sensation of excitement. They fired steadily, took aim carefully, and in a few minutes they had cleared the ridge of Zulus. who went down over the hill and towards the ravine on our left as fast as they could. This movement towards the ravine was blocked by a small party of mounted infantry and Natal Hussars, who had been acting as vedettes at the start of the battle. The combined fire of these troops kept the Zulus at bay on this side of the field, and they remained out of sight for the rest of the battle. Opposite the knoll, the Zulu left wing, who had shown tremendous courage against the combined arms fire of the British, began retiring. Colonel Pearson sent a mixed force of sailors, marines, and infantry to advance in skirmish order up the spur after them, supported by the NNC. The Zulus made a stand near the top of the spur and opened fire, scoring a few hits. More firing and attacks from the British would eventually break the Zulu resolve, and they were forced back. The Victoria Mounted Rifles now had no enemy to their front, so, with the Stangers, they were ordered to join and advance by the Mounted Infantry and Natal Hussars. However, by the time they arrived, the battle was over. The Zulus had shown great skill and courage in their attack against the British column. Only the quick reactions and steady discipline of the British had saved them from disaster. The British had brought their superior firepower to good effect and the Zulus were defeated. But the Zulu army under Gadida managed a steady and orderly withdrawal in the face of their enemy. The Victoria Mounted Rifles now took the time to survey the scene and retrace their steps to the bush. Lieutenant Roberts left a description of the carnage after the battle. We then had the leisure to look at the wounded men, and very pitiful it was to see the poor fellows lying with fearful wounds. They were very quiet, and seemed to bear the pain well, no groaning or crying out. We could not do anything for them except give them water to drink. Some of them were very anxious to be taken by us, and to remain and work. Of course, it was impossible. The vedettes found a great many dead and wounded up on the ridge. One of them had crawled at least a quarter of a mile with a broken leg. One poor fellow was in an ant-bear hole about 70 yards from the vedettes in front of them. And they did not see him for a long time until he called out, asking them to find him. He also wanted to be taken, but of course, it was impossible. It is a fearful thing to see a wounded man uncared for. The excitement is all right enough while it is on, but I do not like to think of those poor fellows left. The rockets scorch whoever they go near. We saw several bodies with burn marks on them. The battlefield needed tidying. The NNC dug a large grave for the 12 men killed outright in the battle. Some Zulu bodies were gathered together, but it was decided that there were too many of them over too large an area for the British to be able to deal with. A great quantity of firearms were also taken from the Zulu dead. Lieutenant Roberts would write, "Our fellows found several guns on the field. I have fitted out Gingwayo with an Enfield rifle, 6 bullets, a powder horn, and caps, so he feels every inch a soldier. He is very proud." Gingwayo was Roberts' servant. The British now had 2 hours of rest, in suffocating heat and with the bodies of the Zulus lying all around. At midday, the column started off again, slowly, to its next encampment 4 miles further down the track. The Victoria Mounted Rifles and the Stangers provided the rear guard, and did not get to camp until around 9 p.m. Lieutenant Roberts recalled after he finished his meal. We lay down with our saddles for pillows. Wrapped in a mackintosh, each man was opposite his horse, and to speak for myself, I never slept so well and enjoyed the night's rest in my life. The following day, the 23rd of January, would see the stand to being given at 3 a.m., and the column set off for the mission station at Eshowe at 5 a.m. The slow march would see the head of the column arrive at 10, and the end of the column pulling in at 3 p.m. Soon finding the station intact, tents were erected and a headquarters established, and the work to make the site suitable for defence began. Bush was cleared and the fields of fire established. Over the following days, routine was established, work done to make Eshowe a suitable depot and jumping off point for the next leg of the invasion, and the officers got to planning this next move. Rumours were also heard. News came that Durnford and his column had been defeated and the colonel killed. The vedettes reported Zulus shouting of a great victory from hilltop to hilltop. Yet for the Victoria Mounted Rifles, there was no clear information how the rest of the British invasion was going. Colonel Pearson himself wasn't certain. Lieutenant Roberts recalled on the 27th of January the following understanding. That Colonel Glyn's column, with the general, have had an encounter with a large Zulu force on the same day as ours, and that they have utterly routed them. There is no doubt that 2 such reverses, as they suffered with this column, will tend to discourage the enemy. The news of Colonel Durnford's death is very sad. Naturally, this information was almost wholly untrue. Colonel Glymm's column had been forced back to Natal after the devastating defeat of a large part of the column at Isanulwana on the 22nd of January. The following day, the 28th, would bring a message that brought a much more dangerous implication for the men of the Victoria Mounted Rifles and No. 1 column as a whole. At the time, the men of the Victoria Mounted Rifles were out with the rest of the mounted men under Major Barrows. They were quickly called back. Lord Chelmsford had ordered Colonel Pearson to disregard all previous orders and decide if he could hold Eshowe, as he would have, very soon, the whole Zulu army on top of him. After much thought, he decided he could and would, but the NNC and Barrow's mounted men should go back to the Tukela. The journey of these men, and what happened to them at the Tukela, is found in my video on the Stanger Mounted Rifles. However, whilst most of the Victoria Mounted Rifles went back to the Tukela, 2 did not. One of these was Trooper Garland. The other's identity I have so far been unable to confirm. These 2 men joined 9 others from the Alexandria Mounted Rifles, Durban Mounted Rifles, and a single Natal Hussar, as well as a group of volunteers from the 99th Regiment to form a scratch mounted force under Captain Charles Shervington. These men would form a group that became known as the Uhlans. They would, every day, ride out in groups of 3, around 2,000 yards away from the fortifications, and provide advanced pickets, giving warning of any Zulu activity around Eshowe. From the departing of Eshowe of Barrow's command until the relief on the 3rd of April, these men would earn the respect of the garrison for their tireless work on guard, patrolling, raiding, burning homesteads, and even attempted POW capture. The story of the Uhlans of Eshowe may be a topic for a future video, if there is interest. The sources used for today's video were Fearful Hard Times, The Siege and Relief of Eshowe, 1879, by Ian Knight and Ian Castle. Zulu War, Volunteers, Irregulars and Auxiliaries, by Ian Castle. And Zulu Rising, by Ian Knight. This was a video in the Units of the Zulu War series by Yet Another History channel. Feel free to support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. And thank you very much for listening.